Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Altai Krai, a vast and rugged territory where the Siberian plains meet the rising peaks of the mountains. Imagine, if you will, the city of Barnaul at the very end of the 20th century. It is a place of heavy iron and deep snow, where the river Ob flows like a ribbon of dark glass beneath bridges that hum with the weight of old Soviet trucks. The year is 1999, and the world is exhaling a collective breath of nervous anticipation as the millennium turns. But in the cracks of this transition, in the places where the streetlights fail to reach, a different kind of darkness is beginning to stir. It is a quiet, unassuming shadow, one that belongs to a man named Mikhail Yudin. The atmosphere in Barnaul during these months is thick with the scent of coal smoke and the metallic tang of industrial exhaust. The architecture is a landscape of gray concrete, the famous Khrushchevka apartment blocks standing like silent sentinels against the biting wind. It is a city of hard edges and soft, drifting flakes of ice. People move quickly here, their heads bowed against the chill, their breath blooming in white clouds before vanishing into the frozen air. There is a sense of exhaustion in the city, a lingering fatigue from a decade of upheaval. Yet there is also a strange, quiet beauty in the way the frost patterns climb the windows of the local trams. It is within this stillness, this mundane, everyday struggle, that our story takes root. The first shadow did not arrive with a scream, but with a silence that no one noticed until it was far too late. In the heat of the summer of 1999, the Altai landscape changes. The snow retreats to the high peaks, leaving the valleys around Barnaul lush with tall, golden grass and thickets of birch trees. It was during this deceptive warmth that 16-year-old Anastasia Fatkova was walking near a bus stop. The air would have been heavy with the hum of insects and the sweet, dusty smell of the sun-baked earth. She was young, her life a series of open doors, perhaps thinking of the coming school year or the simple joys of a summer evening. She could not have known that a predator was watching from the periphery. Mikhail Yudin was not a monster from a fairy tale. He was a man of the earth, a laborer, someone who blended into the industrial backdrop of the region with terrifying ease. He moved with a heavy, deliberate step, a man whose presence was as unremarkable as the gravel on the roadside. The details of that summer day are a somber reflection of how easily safety can dissolve. Near that lonely bus stop, Yudin lured the young girl into the dense undergrowth. Think of the contrast, the bright, azure sky above and the suffocating darkness within the tall weeds. He was a man of immense, repressed anger, and on that day he allowed it to surface. The attack was not quick. It was a slow, agonizing realization for the victim that the world had suddenly narrowed down to this one violent point. Even as random passers-by walked along the path just yards away, their footsteps crunching on the dry soil, the world remained indifferent. Yudin did not flee. He stayed, anchored by his own terrible impulses, listening to those footsteps pass by while he claimed his first victim. This was the birth of the shadow, a moment where the boundary between a troubled man and a serial killer was crossed forever. As the sun set on that summer, the seasons began their inevitable slide toward the dark. By November of 1999, the warmth was a distant memory. Barnaul was once again gripped by the frost, the kind of cold that makes the bones ache and the spirit retreat indoors. The city was preparing for the festivities of the coming new year, the streets decorated with modest lights that flickered against the early dusk. It was on the 23rd of November that the shadow moved again, this time entering the very sanctuary of a home. Olga Karpova was in her apartment, a place that should have been a fortress against the Siberian winter. The heaters would have been clanking softly, providing a dry, rhythmic warmth. But Yudin, fueled by intoxication and a growing sense of impunity, broke that sanctity. He was a man who took more than just lives, he took trophies. After the life had left Olga, he reached for her fur coat, a heavy, practical garment meant to ward off the cold, and he took it home to his own wife. There is a profound chilling quality to that image. A man walking through the snow-dusted streets of Barnaul, carrying a stolen coat as if it were a simple gift, while the true owner lay silent in her apartment. This was the pattern that began to emerge at the turn of the millennium. Mikhail Yudin was a ghost in the machinery of the Altai. He was arrested briefly for robbery later that winter, but in a twist of fate that seems almost impossible in hindsight, he was granted amnesty. In the summer of 2000, as the city celebrated the 55th anniversary of the Great Victory, the doors of his cell opened and he walked free. The shadow was let back into the light, and the people of Barnaul had no idea that the predator among them was now more emboldened than ever. The first shadow had fallen, and as we close our eyes tonight, we must remember that it was only the beginning of a much longer, darker winter. Beyond the concrete edges of the city, the Siberian landscape stretches into a vast, silent architecture of birch and pine. It is a place where the air carries a distinct, sharp metallic edge, and the ground remains hard with a deep-seated frost that never truly seems to leave the marrow of the earth. In the transition between the late 90s and the early 2000s, these wooded belts, the plantations that ringed the outskirts, became more than just a barrier against the wind. They became a repository for secrets that the local militia was not yet prepared to uncover. Imagine, if you will, the stillness of a morning where the sun is a pale, distant coin in a gray sky, casting long, thin shadows across the forest floor. The only sound is the occasional snap of a frozen twig or the rhythmic crunch of boots on brittle, fallen leaves. It was in this deceptive peace that the first physical evidence of a predator began to surface, pulling the investigators away from their warm offices and into the unforgiving cold of the wild. The discovery was not the result of a grand tactical sweep or a sophisticated tip, but rather the accidental misfortune of a passerby. In the dense undergrowth near a quiet transit point, the earth surrendered a fragment of a life interrupted. To the untrained eye, it might have been a discarded bundle of rags or a shadow cast by a crooked root. But to those who live in the shadow of such terrain, there is a specific, haunting stillness to a body that has become part of the landscape. When the call finally reached the local militia, the response was one of grim routine shifting slowly into something more chilling. They arrived in their heavy coats, their breath blossoming in the air like small, fading ghosts. At first, the officers moved with a practiced detachment, a psychological armor against the tragedy they were expected to document. But as they cleared the brush and the true nature of the scene became clear, the casual murmurs of the men died away, replaced by the heavy realization that the stolen coat mentioned in the whispers of the town was only the beginning of a much darker tapestry. Processing a crime scene in the heart of a Siberian winter is a battle against time and the elements. The soil, as hard as granite, refuses to yield to the shovel or the trowel. Every piece of evidence, a strand of hair, a stray button, a peculiar mark on a tree, is often encased in a thin, stubborn layer of ice. The forensic teams of the era found themselves frustrated by an environment that both preserved and obscured. While the cold halted the natural processes of decay, it also made the recovery of biological markers an agonizingly slow process. They had to work with a delicacy that felt at odds with the brutal nature of the crime. Using portable heaters that hissed against the silence, they tried to thaw small patches of ground, watching as the steam rose into the trees. It was a painstaking labor, where a single mistake could shatter a frozen clue into 1,000 pieces of meaningless dust. The officers spent hours on their knees, their fingers numbing despite their gloves, searching for anything that would tell them who had stood in this spot and why they had left such a void behind. The militia's initial reaction was a mixture of bureaucratic skepticism and a rising, localized panic. In those days, the systems of communication between districts were not the instantaneous networks we know today. Reports were filed on paper, moved by hand, and often languished in folders while the perpetrator continued to walk the very streets the officers patrolled. There was a sense that this discovery was an isolated tragedy, perhaps a robbery gone wrong or a personal dispute fueled by the heavy drinking that haunted the local construction sites. They looked at the missing jewelry, the stolen watches, and the earrings that were no longer there, and they saw a thief. They did not yet see the collector. They did not see the man who sat in a quiet barn, admiring these trophies as if they were holy relics. The challenges were not just physical, they were mental. To admit that a serial predator was operating in their midst was to admit a failure of the safety they promised to the citizens of the Altai region. And so, the investigation moved with the heavy, sluggish pace of a river choked with ice, while the shadow in the woods grew longer and more confident. As the weeks turned into months during the year 2000, more reports began to filter in. A flute was missing from a music student. A watch was gone from a woman near the factory. The woods, once a place for families to gather mushrooms or for couples to find a moment of privacy, became a territory of suspicion. The forensic teams continued to struggle with the shifting seasons. When the thaw finally came, it brought its own set of horrors, revealing what the snow had been hiding for months. The meltwater would wash away delicate footprints, and the awakening wildlife would disturb the remains, making the task of reconstructing the final moments of the victims almost impossible. Every discovery followed a similar, haunting pattern: a secluded spot, a sudden act of violence, and a clinical removal of personal items. The militia began to realize that the man they were looking for was someone who understood the forest as well as they did, someone who knew exactly how much time the frost would give him before the world took notice. The silence of the woods was no longer a comfort. It was a warning that the predator was still out there, watching the investigators from the safety of the trees. By the end of this period, the weight of the evidence had become an undeniable burden. The militia could no longer treat these as disconnected incidents of urban violence. The forensic challenges had forged a new kind of resolve, albeit a slow one. They began to look closer at the construction crews, the men who moved between cities like Novosibirsk and Berdsk, men who were invisible because they were everywhere. They looked for the man who didn't fit in, the one whose character changed only when he was under the influence of the very spirits that dampened the cold. But for now, the woods remained a place of mourning. The first remains were identified, and the names of the lost began to echo through the halls of the precinct. As the wind continued to howl through the birch branches, the city held its breath, knowing that the discovery of the bodies was only the first step in a long, cold journey toward a truth that no one truly wanted to face. The earth had spoken, but the man responsible was still a ghost, drifting through the snowfall with a stolen coat and a heart of ice. The year 2000 arrived with a weight that the residents of Berdsk could not yet name. It was a season of transition, where the lingering heat of August began to fray at the edges, giving way to the sharp, thin air of a Siberian autumn. In the hallways of the local universities and the rooms of the Novosibirsk Conservatory, there was the usual hum of new beginnings. Students carried stacks of fresh sheet music and heavy textbooks, their footsteps echoing against the linoleum and stone. But beneath this rhythm of academic life, a different, more jagged tempo was starting to emerge. It began as a series of whispers, a quiet ripple of concern that passed between parents at bus stops and friends over tea. A few young women had not come home. In a city where the industrial silhouette of the giant plant loomed over the landscape, people were used to the grit of hard work, but they were not prepared for the silence that follows a sudden vanishing. On the 26th of August, in the year 2000, the first shadow fell deeply over the community. Svetlana Minina was only 21 years old, a young woman with her whole life mapped out before her like an open road. She was known for her bright energy, the kind of person who filled a room with her presence. When she disappeared, it felt as though a light had been extinguished without warning. There were no cries for help heard in the thickets near the bus stops, no signs of a struggle left on the dusty paths. She simply wasn't there anymore. The militia looked into the usual corners, questioning acquaintances and searching the local industrial zones, but the earth seemed to have swallowed her whole. The sun continued to set over the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, but for Svetlana's family, the daylight brought no comfort. The uncertainty was a physical weight, a cold draft that wouldn't leave the house. Less than 2 weeks later, on the 9th of September, the unease turned into a sharp, piercing fear. Tatiana Samokvalova was 22, a dedicated student at the music conservatory. She spent her days immersed in the intricate patterns of classical compositions, her fingers finding solace in the silver keys of her flute. That evening, she was returning from a rehearsal, the melody of the day still perhaps humming in her mind. She carried her instrument in its case, a precious companion on her walk home through the darkening streets of Berdsk. Tatiana never reached her door. When the authorities eventually looked for her, they found something that chilled the local heart more than any cold wind ever could. Tatiana was gone, and so was her flute. It was a detail that felt unnecessarily cruel, a theft of her voice and her passion. The loss of a student from such a prestigious institution sent a shockwave through the student body. The music in the conservatory halls grew hushed, replaced by the sound of heavy doors locking and the quickened pace of those walking to their cars. As the news spread, a terrifying pattern began to emerge in the public consciousness. It was whispered that the shadow stalking the streets had a preference, a specific and haunting focus. The victims were often petite, young women with dark hair. This observation spread through the city like a fever. Suddenly, the simple act of being a brunette became a source of profound vulnerability. In the local markets and small beauty shops, the shelves were cleared of hair dye. Women who had spent years as brunettes suddenly appeared with shades of blonde or copper, hoping a change in appearance might act as a shield against the unseen hunter. Form-fitting trousers, once a staple of youth fashion, were traded for baggy coats and long skirts that hid the silhouette. The vibrant, individual expressions of the young women of Berdsk were being erased by a collective mask of caution. The city was changing its face out of pure, unadulterated terror. While the city held its breath, a man named Mikhail Yudin sat in the quiet of his own space, away from the frantic eyes of the public. In a small, unassuming barn, the air was still and heavy with the scent of old wood and earth. Here, the chaos of the outside world did not reach. Yudin would spend hours in this solitude, surrounded by the objects he had gathered. Among the tools and the shadows, he had placed his trophies. He would look at them, perhaps touching the smooth metal of a stolen flute, relishing the silence that he had created. To the neighbors, he was a sullen man, someone who kept to himself and worked his construction jobs without much to say. They saw the stiffness in his walk and the coldness in his eyes, but they did not see the barn. They did not see the way he admired the remnants of the lives he had dismantled. He was a man who lived in the cracks of society, invisible because he was so unremarkable, even as he held the city in a grip of invisible iron. By the time October arrived, the atmosphere in Berdsk had reached a breaking point. Parents stood outside school gates long before the final bell rang, their eyes scanning the horizon for any movement. Social life for the young had vanished. The cafes were empty by dusk, and the streetlights flickered over deserted pavements. Every footstep behind a lone pedestrian felt like a threat. Every engine idling at a curb sounded like a predator. The school year of 2000, which had begun with the promise of a new century, was now defined by the empty desks in lecture halls and the frantic prayers of a community that realized their daughters were no longer safe. The militia felt the pressure, a mounting tide of evidence that these were not random acts of wandering souls, but the calculated strikes of someone living among them. The vanishing had become a presence, a ghost that walked the streets of Berdsk, waiting for the next autumn leaf to fall. The year 1999 faded into 2000, and with the turning of the calendar, a heavy, static tension settled over the city of Birdsk. Inside the local police headquarters, the air was often thick with the smell of cheap tobacco and the hum of fluorescent lights that flickered with a rhythmic, hypnotic buzz. Investigators sat surrounded by growing stacks of manila folders, their edges softened by the constant shuffling of hands. For a long time, the incidents were treated as tragic, isolated shadows in the night. But as the months stretched on, the silence of the station was replaced by the scratching of pencils against paper, as detectives began to draw lines between points that had once seemed miles apart. They were no longer looking at random tragedies. They were looking at a map of a predator's territory. The geography of the crimes began to tell a story of its own. On the precinct wall, a large paper map of the Novosibirsk region was pinned, its surface marked with small, colorful pins that clustered with terrifying intent. One cluster sat near the giant industrial plant, a place of gray concrete and whistling winds, where the first echoes of violence had been heard as early as August of 1998. Other marks appeared near lonely bus stops and the dark, tangled fringes of the plantations on the outskirts of the city. These were places where the urban landscape dissolved into the thick, whispering birch forests of Siberia. The investigators' fingers would trace the paths between these points, noting how the attacker seemed to favor the transitional spaces. The edges of the woods, where a scream might be muffled by the dense leaves, or the quiet corridors of apartment complexes, where the world felt deceptively private. As the pattern solidified, the profile of the victims became hauntingly specific. It was a detail that traveled through the whispers of the town like a cold draft. The attacker seemed to be seeking a very particular image. He targeted petite women with dark hair, brunettes who often wore form-fitting trousers or jeans. This realization sent a wave of quiet panic through the community. In the privacy of their homes, women looked into their mirrors and saw a target. They began to change. Many chose to dye their hair lighter colors, hoping to blur the edges of the predator's vision. They traded their favorite clothes for loose, bulky garments that hid their frames. Every woman walking home at dusk became a student of the shadows, listening for the sound of footsteps that didn't match their own, wondering if they fit the profile that was currently being typed into a police report. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the emerging pattern was not just where he struck, but what he took with him. The reports began to list missing items, small, personal trinkets that seemed far too insignificant for a common thief. A wristwatch, a pair of simple earrings, or a piece of jewelry. One victim, a talented student from the Novosibirsk Conservatory, had been carrying a flute. When her body was discovered, the instrument was gone. These weren't just stolen goods, they were trophies. The thought of the attacker sitting in a quiet room, perhaps a barn or a shed, surrounded by these stolen pieces of lives, was a nightmare that the investigators couldn't shake. He was collecting memories of his violence, keeping them close, or worse, giving them away as gifts to the unsuspecting women in his own life, turning symbols of tragedy into everyday accessories. By the end of 2002, the police knew they were hunting a ghost who had a face and a routine, yet remained maddeningly out of reach. They looked at the case of Yulia, who was taken in December of that year, and they saw the same signature of strangulation and cold, calculated precision. The investigators worked through the nights, their eyes tired from reading the same descriptions of petite brunettes and wooded paths. They knew the man they were looking for was likely someone who appeared unremarkable, someone who blended into the construction sites and the morning commutes of Birdsk. The pattern was complete, the map was marked, and the profile was set. The city held its breath, waiting for the moment when the man in the shadows would finally step into the light of the station's interrogation room. By the winter of 2000, the cold in Novosibirsk felt sharper than usual, biting through thick coats and woolen scarves. But it wasn't just the Siberian wind that made the students of the university district shiver. A different kind of chill had settled into the stone hallways and the cramped dormitory rooms. It was a silence born of suspicion. In the student hostels, where music and laughter usually spilled out from under every door, the atmosphere had become heavy and guarded. Every footstep in the corridor was scrutinized, and every shadow cast by the dim, flickering yellow bulbs seemed to stretch into the shape of a man. The vibrant energy of youth was being systematically replaced by a quiet, pervasive dread that something or someone was watching the bus stops and the dormitory gates with a predator's patience. The rumors began as whispers over communal stoves and in the steam-filled shared bathrooms. They spoke of a man who moved like a ghost between Birdsk and the university district. In those narrow living spaces, where 3 or 4 students shared a single room, the safety of numbers felt increasingly fragile. The girls spoke of the specific preferences this phantom seemed to have. Word had spread that he targeted petite young women with dark hair, specifically those who wore form-fitting clothing. This realization triggered a heartbreaking transformation across the campus. In the mirrors of the dormitory washrooms, 19- and 20-year-old women began to hide themselves. Brunettes used harsh chemicals to bleach their hair a frantic, brassy blonde, hoping to become invisible to the killer. Elegant coats were traded for oversized, shapeless jackets, and the once bustling paths between the lecture halls and the sleeping quarters became deserted long before the sun dipped below the horizon. The fear reached a fever pitch following the disappearance of a student from the Novosibirsk Conservatory. She had been a musician, a girl dedicated to the delicate art of the flute. On an evening that should have been marked only by the echoes of her practice, she vanished into the autumn gloom. When her absence was finally understood as something permanent, the university community shattered. It wasn't just a life that had been taken. It was the sacred routine of the student. The image of her carrying her flute case home through the twilight became a haunting symbol for every other girl in the city. They realized that their passions, their studies, and their very futures were being hunted. The police had little to offer except warnings, leaving the students to form their own networks of survival, vowing never to walk alone, even for the shortest distance between a bus and a doorway. Among the terror, the first tangible descriptions of a suspect began to emerge from those who had brushed against the darkness and survived. One woman, who had been approached near the giant plant, described a man who was maddeningly ordinary. He didn't look like a monster from a storybook. He looked like a worker, a builder, someone who belonged in the gray, industrial landscape of the region. Witnesses recalled a man who was sullen and stiff in his movements, someone who stood at the edges of bus stops with a rigid, uncomfortable posture. He was a man of medium height, often dressed in a dark, nondescript coat that allowed him to blend into the evening crowds. This ordinariness was perhaps the most terrifying detail of all. He wasn't a stranger from far away. He was a man who knew the bus schedules, the shortcuts through the plantations, and the exact moment when a girl would be most alone. In the dormitories, the buddy system became a law of life. If a roommate was 10 minutes late, panic would set in. Girls would stand by the windows, peering out into the darkness of the Siberian night, watching for the familiar silhouette of a friend. They listened for the sound of the heavy main door latching shut, a sound that brought a brief, fleeting moment of relief. The psychological toll was immense. Education, which was supposed to be a path to a brighter life, now felt like a dangerous gamble. Every lecture that ended late was a source of anxiety. Every trip to the library was a calculated risk. The predator, Mikhail Yudin, was effectively holding the entire academic population hostage, his presence felt in every locked bolt and every nervous glance over a shoulder. By the time the year 2002 arrived, the university district had changed. The innocence of student life had been replaced by a grim vigilance. People remembered the flute player and the girls who never made it back to their rooms. They remembered the man in the dark coat who seemed to linger where the streetlights failed. The whispers in the halls were no longer about exams or romances. They were about survival. The hunt for the Birdsk maniac was narrowing, but for the students living in the shadow of his crimes, the damage was already done. The halls remained quiet, the doors remained locked, and the city waited with bated breath for the moment the ghost would finally be given a name and a pair of handcuffs. The summer of 2001 descended upon the Novosibirsk region with a heavy, suffocating weight. It was a heat that did not just warm the skin. It seemed to press against the chest, slowing every movement and turning the air into something thick and difficult to breathe. In the city of Birdsk, the atmosphere was saturated with the scent of sun-baked pine needles and the fine, gray dust of the industrial districts. But beneath the natural smells of a Siberian summer, there was a layer of tension that felt like a low-frequency hum. It was a silence that felt unnatural. For over 2 years, a shadow had been moving through these streets and the surrounding woods, leaving a trail of grief that the local authorities could not seem to map. By June of that year, the investigation had reached a state of agonizing stillness. The frantic energy of the previous year, when multiple victims had been found in the plantations, had faded into a dull, repetitive ache for the detectives assigned to the case. Every morning, the lead investigators would gather in a cramped office, where the windows were perpetually streaked with city grime, blurring the world outside. They would sit in the dim light, looking at the grainy black and white photographs of the victims. These were young women, mostly petite with dark hair, whose lives had been abruptly ended near lonely bus stops or in the dense, tangled brush of the forests. The map on the wall had become a constellation of failure. Each red pin represented a location where a body had been discovered, or where a survivor had narrowly escaped the grip of the man the public was now calling the Birdsk maniac. But as the temperatures climbed throughout 2001, the pins stopped appearing. The killer had seemingly vanished into the shimmering heat haze, leaving the police to sift through thousands of leads that led nowhere, like tracks ending at the edge of a deep lake. The exhaustion in the precinct was palpable, visible in the slumped shoulders and bloodshot eyes of men who had forgotten what it felt like to sleep without dreaming of crime scenes. It was the kind of fatigue that coffee could no longer touch. Detectives sat at desks cluttered with overflowing ashtrays and rings from cold tea, rereading witness statements for the 100th time. They obsessed over the woman near the giant plant from 1998, the one who had survived and given them a glimpse of the predator. They wondered if they had missed a vital detail in her description, or if the man she described was the same ghost who had later stolen a flute from a conservatory student. The cruelty of the crimes was matched only by the mundane nature of the trophies he took. It was a chilling realization that somewhere in the city, a mother might be wearing stolen earrings, or a wife might be checking a watch that had been taken from a dying girl as a gift. The detectives knew these items were out there, but in a city of hundreds of thousands, a single silver earring is just a fleeting glint in the dust. While the authorities struggled, the public lived in a state of quiet, desperate siege. This was remembered as the silent summer because the usual laughter had been drained from the public parks. Young women, fearful of the specific profile the killer favored, began to radically change their appearances. They dyed their dark hair blonde, wore baggy, unflattering clothes to hide their silhouettes, and refused to walk alone even when the sun was high. The bus stops, once places of transition and casual, neighborly conversation, became sites of intense, suspicious vigilance. People watched the shadows between the birch trees, listening for the soft, rhythmic crunch of footsteps on dry grass or the clicking of a bicycle chain. They did not know that the man they feared was a simple construction worker named Mikhail Yudin. He was a man of sullen stiffness, a person who lived a quiet, unremarkable life while blending into the very foundations of the buildings the community inhabited. During that long, dry stretch of 2001, Yudin moved through the world like a ghost. The police had interviewed hundreds of men with similar backgrounds, but he remained just another face in the crowd, invisible in his ordinariness. The lack of advanced DNA technology in the region at the time meant that the investigators were relying on the old ways of the trade: shoe leather, grit, and intuition. But intuition is a fragile thing when it is starved of new evidence for months on end. This silent period was perhaps the most agonizing for the families of the victims. Without any news or breakthroughs, there was no closure, only the recurring nightmare that the person responsible was walking the same streets, perhaps even standing behind them in line at a grocery store or sitting on the same bus. The silence of the killer was not a sign of peace. It was a sign of a predator who had learned how to wait. By the time August arrived, the investigation felt as though it were drowning in its own paperwork. Every new report of a suspicious person turned out to be a neighbor with a grudge or a simple misunderstanding born of high-strung nerves. The detectives felt the weight of the community's gaze, a heavy mixture of desperation and growing distrust. They were looking for a monster with horns, but the monster was hiding in the most terrifying place of all: the mundane routine of a working-class life. As the summer of 2001 began to fade into a crisp, early autumn, the silence remained stubbornly unbroken. The Birdsk maniac had not been caught, and as the nights began to pull closer, the shadows in the forest seemed to grow longer and deeper, waiting for the inevitable moment when the world would finally let its guard down once again. The transition from a string of local tragedies to a full-scale regional crisis happened slowly, then all at once. Inside the dimly lit offices of the regional prosecutor's office, the air was thick with the scent of stale tea and the metallic tang of old radiator pipes that clanked in the corners. The investigation had moved beyond the simple gathering of physical evidence. It had become an obsession with the invisible. As the calendar turned from the late 1990s into the early 2000s, the realization settled over the investigators like a cold Siberian fog. They were not looking for a wandering vagrant or a sudden burst of madness. They were looking for a shadow that lived among them. A man who walked the same cracked pavement as his victims, who perhaps even stood in the same lines for bread or waited for the same electric buses that rattled through the industrial outskirts of the city. Every folder on the desk felt heavier than the day before, weighted down by the mounting pressure to find a man who left no traces other than the silence he left behind. The psychological profile began to take shape, not through what the killer left behind, but through the terrifying deliberation of what he took away. Profilers from the higher echelons of the regional ministry began to study the grim remains with a clinical, detached focus. They spent hours under the hum of fluorescent lights, looking at maps of the Novosibirsk districts, marking each discovery with a red pin that felt like a drop of blood on the paper. They saw a pattern of increasing confidence that troubled them deeply. This was a man who understood the secret rhythm of the city. He knew when the shift changes happened at the local factories, and he knew exactly which streetlights would flicker and die in the heavy autumn rain. They described him as a man who found a terrible, fleeting organization only in the moments of his crimes. In his daily life, he was likely someone who felt small and overlooked, perhaps a low-level laborer or a man forgotten by the rapid, jarring changes of post-Soviet society, who sought a dark, absolute control over those he deemed more vulnerable than himself. The emerging profile suggested a man of contradictions. Witnesses from his past, interviewed later, would describe him as sullen and stiff in his communication, a man who seemed to carry a heavy, unspoken weight. He was a veteran of the army, a detail that suggested he understood discipline and how to move through the world without drawing attention. Following his discharge, he had drifted into the construction industry, working at various sites across the Novosibirsk Oblast. This gave him a reason to be anywhere, to blend in with the thousands of men in work clothes who moved between the city and its surrounding towns like Birdsk. The profilers noted that his character reportedly changed only when he was under the influence of alcohol, shifting from a quiet, socially awkward laborer into something far more predatory. This duality made him a phantom. To his neighbors and coworkers, He was just another quiet man living with his mother and brother, unremarkable in every way. By the winter of the year 2000, the local authorities could no longer hold the weight of the case alone. The file had grown too thick, the implications too heavy for a single precinct to manage. The case was officially elevated to a regional priority, drawing the eyes of high-ranking officials from Moscow who demanded results that the local investigators were struggling to provide. Every morning, the lead detectives would arrive to find new directives waiting on their desks, written in the cold, precise language of high-level bureaucracy. The pressure was a physical presence in the room, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to settle in the bones of everyone involved. They were no longer just searching for a killer. They were fighting to restore a sense of order to a region that felt it was slipping into a chaotic, predatory darkness. This transition brought more resources, but it also brought a frantic urgency that threatened to derail the careful, methodical work they had done so far. What chilled the investigators the most as they refined their profile was the sheer, terrifying mundanity of the suspect's behavior after his crimes. They began to suspect he was keeping trophies, but the reality was more unsettling than they had imagined. He wasn't just hoarding items in a secret basement. He was integrating them into his ordinary life. He would take a watch from one victim and present it to his wife, or give a pair of earrings to his mother. He even took a flute from a young student of the Novosibirsk Conservatory, a silver instrument that had been her pride and joy. There was a sickening domesticity to his actions, a way of masking his violence behind the facade of a caring family man. This ability to return home and play the role of a husband or son after committing such atrocities was the ultimate challenge for the profilers. It meant their suspect wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was hiding in the light of his own home. As the search intensified and the profile became more specific, the city of Novosibirsk itself seemed to change its very character. The vibrant energy of the new millennium was shadowed by a quiet, pervasive dread that moved through the streets like a draft. Women began to walk in pairs, their eyes darting toward the dark, yawning spaces between the massive apartment blocks. The sound of a single footstep on the packed snow behind a person became a reason to catch one's breath and quicken one's pace. The investigators felt this tension every time they stepped outside the precinct. They looked at every passerby, the man in the heavy wool coat, the youth with the tired, hollow eyes, the laborer with the scarred, calloused hands, and wondered if they were looking directly into the eyes of the one who had caused so much grief. The profile was a mirror, but it was a mirror that showed 1,000 different faces, making the truth feel like a ghost that vanished every time they reached out to touch it in the flickering, uncertain light of the street lamps. By the arrival of early 2002, the air around the outskirts of Novosibirsk and the neighboring town of Berdsk carried a weight that no amount of falling snow could bury. The investigation, which had once felt like casting a net into a vast, dark ocean, began to change its shape. The authorities were no longer simply looking for a ghost in the crowd. They were looking for a man who moved through the local geography with the practiced ease of a predator in his own territory. This shift was subtle at first, a quiet redirection of resources and attention. The sprawling, gray landscapes of the industrial zones and the dense, silent stands of trees known as the plantations became the central focus of every conversation held in the dim light of the precinct. There was a growing, heavy realization that the shadow they hunted was not a traveler passing through, but someone who likely woke up, worked, and walked among the very people who now lived in constant, breathless fear. Investigators began to scrutinize the specific topography of the crimes committed between 1999 and the early months of 2002. They noticed a pattern in the way the attacker utilized the bus stops and the desolate paths that cut through the thick brush near the Berdsk plant known as Giant. To a stranger, these paths were nothing more than treacherous tangles of birch and pine, but to the killer, they were corridors. This suggested a level of local knowledge that was intimate and deeply ingrained. The search narrowed toward those who lived on the fringes of the residential sectors, specifically men who worked in the construction trade or at the local factories. These were men who understood the rhythm of the shifts, who knew exactly when the morning workers would be arriving, and when the evening quiet would settle over the forest edge like a shroud. The investigators started to look closer at the residents of the Zachalinski area and the industrial belts, searching for a face that didn't stand out, a face that belonged in the mud and the sawdust of the region. The psychological climate of the city had become incredibly fragile. Because the profile of the victims was so specific, often petite women with dark hair, the local population began to adapt in ways that were both heartbreaking and desperate. In the winter of 2002, you would see fewer and fewer women walking alone as the sun began its early descent. Those who had to be out would often change their appearance, pinning up their hair or wearing bulky clothing to hide their silhouettes. The police urged the public to be vigilant, but the vigilance turned into a pervasive paranoia. Every man seen standing a little too long near a bus stop or walking with a heavy, sullen gait became a subject of suspicion. The detectives leaned into this communal tension, beginning a systematic door-to-door inquiry in the neighborhoods closest to the forest outskirts. They weren't just looking for evidence anymore. They were looking for a specific type of personality. The quiet, solitary neighbor who seemed to disappear into the woodwork of the town. During this phase, the police revisited files of men who had previously been detained for smaller infractions, such as robbery or public intoxication. They were searching for a thread of escalation. They knew that many serial offenders begin with smaller acts of brigandage or robbery before their violence deepens. In their archives, they found records of men who had been released during the amnesty of 2000, a period that had seen many individuals return to the streets. The investigators began the tedious work of tracking these men down, checking their current employment and their proximity to the crime scenes. It was a slow, grinding process, much like the thawing of the Siberian earth. They spent hours in the cold, observing construction sites and monitoring the paths that led from the factories into the wooded plantations. They were looking for someone who displayed a certain stiffness in communication, a man who might be described by his neighbors as sullen or strangely detached from the social fabric of the community. The focus on the forest outskirts was not merely about where the crimes occurred, but about where the killer felt safe. The woods around Berdsk and the Zachalinski district are dense and deceptive. In the spring and summer, the foliage provides a thick green curtain that muffles sound and hides movement. In the winter, the deep snow absorbs the echoes of a struggle. The police realized that the perpetrator must have spent a significant amount of time in these places, perhaps even using small structures or barns to store trophies or hide from view. This led the search teams to inspect every abandoned shack and utility shed within a 5-mile radius of the main attack sites. They were looking for signs of a long-term presence, a discarded item, a footprint, or the lingering scent of someone who felt at home in the isolation of the trees. Every piece of rusted metal and every broken branch was treated with a newfound level of scrutiny as the net began to tighten around the local geography. As the investigation pressed on through 2002, the list of potential suspects began to shrink from thousands to hundreds, and then to a select few dozen. The tactical shift from broad sweeps to targeted, local surveillance was beginning to yield a different kind of data. They were no longer looking for a monster that lived in the headlines. They were looking for a man who might be sitting in a kitchen just blocks away, perhaps cleaning the mud from his boots after a long walk through the pines. The silence of the forest was no longer just a backdrop for tragedy. It had become a witness. The detectives knew that eventually, the man who knew the woods so well would make a mistake within those very trees. They waited, watching the outskirts with a patience that was as cold and unyielding as the permafrost. knowing that the killer's familiarity with the land was becoming his most visible trail. The hunt had moved from the streets into the very soul of the landscape, where the shadows were longest and the truth was buried deepest. The winter of 2002 descended upon the city of Birdsk with a heavy, suffocating silence. It was a cold that bit through the thickest wool, turning the breath of the militia officers into rhythmic clouds of steam as they paced the dimly lit corridors of the precinct. For years, a shadow had been moving through these streets, a predator who chose his moments with terrifying precision. The atmosphere in the city had shifted from mere concern to a deep, bone-chilling dread. Women who once walked freely now kept their heads down, many of them altering their appearance, dyeing their dark hair or trading their fitted clothes for heavy, shapeless coats, hoping to become invisible to the monster known as the Birdsk maniac. But as the investigation ground forward, the heavy machinery of justice began to turn its gears toward a single, unremarkable name. The slip of the mask did not happen with a grand flourish or a dramatic mistake. It began with the slow, tedious work of re-examining files that had been gathering dust for years. The militia was looking for a ghost, but what they found was a man who had already been in their grasp and let go. In the autumn of 1999, a man had been detained for a minor attempted robbery, only to be released months later under a general amnesty celebrating the 55th anniversary of the Great Victory. At the time, he was just another face in a sea of petty offenders. But now, as the investigators cross-referenced the dates of the disappearances with the movements of recently released convicts, the name Mikhail Yudin began to glow with a strange, dark significance on their lists. A crucial encounter from 2 years prior finally reached the ears of the lead investigators. It was the story of a woman named Alina. On a cold October night in the year 2000, she had faced the predator and survived. Unlike the others, she had fought back with a ferocity that caught the attacker off guard, forcing him to flee. But the most chilling detail was what happened next. Instead of vanishing, the man had sought her out later, not to finish the job, but to offer a bribe. He had handed over a handful of rubles, a desperate and pathetic attempt to buy her silence, to keep his secret buried in the dirt. At the time, the incident had been recorded as a common assault, disconnected from the string of murders. But when the militia brought Alina in to look at photographs in late 2002, her finger stopped on one particular face. It was the face of the sullen construction worker. It was Mikhail Yudin. The identification was the spark the militia needed, but they were cautious. They knew that a single witness identification from a traumatized survivor might not be enough to secure a conviction for 5 murders. They needed to see him in his natural habitat. They needed to watch the mask in place before they could tear it away. A surveillance operation was established, a quiet net cast around the life of a man who appeared, to the outside world, to be nothing more than a quiet, perhaps slightly withdrawn, husband and laborer. 2 plainclothes officers were assigned to follow him, sitting in a nondescript vehicle that blended into the gray landscape of the industrial district where Yudin worked. From their frozen vantage point, the officers watched as Yudin emerged from his home each morning. He moved with a heavy, deliberate gait, his chin tucked into his collar to shield himself from the Siberian wind. There was nothing in his stride that suggested the violence he was capable of. He would arrive at the construction site, blending perfectly with the other men in their stained overalls and heavy boots. He spoke little, his coworkers later describing him as a man of few words, someone who only seemed to truly come alive or change his temperament when he had been drinking. The officers followed him to the local shops, watching as he bought bread and milk, acting out the role of a mundane citizen while the blood of 5 women stained his history. The most intriguing part of his routine was his visits to a small, weathered barn on the outskirts of his property. The surveillance team watched from a distance as Yudin would disappear into the shadows of that wooden structure for hours at a time. Through the slats of the walls, they could see the dim glow of a single lantern. They wondered what he was doing in the dark. Was he repairing tools? Or was he reliving the moments that had paralyzed the city? Inside that barn, hidden from the eyes of his wife and mother, Yudin kept his trophies. He would sit in the silence, holding a flute he had taken from a young music student, or turning a stolen watch over in his hands, listening to the ticking of a life he had extinguished. The officers didn't know about the trophies yet, but they felt the weight of the secrets radiating from the building. As the days turned into weeks in late 2002, the pressure on the surveillance team grew. Every time Yudin approached a lone woman on the street or lingered too long near a dark alleyway, the officers' hands would drift to their radios, ready to intervene. They were playing a dangerous game of patience, waiting for the moment when his guard would drop entirely. They observed him meeting with his friend, a man named Alexei, drinking until their voices grew loud in the night air. The militia saw the way Yudin's eyes would sharpen when he looked at the petite brunettes walking past the tavern. A look of predatory assessment that lasted only a second before the mask of the dull laborer was pulled back into place. They knew they were watching a killer. They only needed the biological proof to bridge the gap between suspicion and the cage. The surveillance continued into the early months of the following year, a long, cold vigil that tested the sanity of the men in the car. They watched as Yudin celebrated the new year, watched as he performed the chores of a dutiful son, and watched as he carefully maintained the facade of an innocent man. But beneath the surface, the genetic evidence was being processed in a laboratory miles away. The militia kept their eyes on him, never letting him out of their sight for more than an hour, waiting for the final word that would allow them to descend. The slip of the mask was complete in their minds, but the world was still waiting for the monster to be unmasked in the light of day. The net was closing, and Mikhail Yudin had no idea that his every breath was being counted by the shadows behind him. The heat of August 2002 was a physical weight, a thick, airless blanket that seemed to press the very breath from the lungs of the city. For months, the investigators had lived in the margins, existing in the cramped, airless confines of surveillance vehicles and the dim corners of precinct offices. But on this particular afternoon, the long, cold vigil finally reached its boiling point. The air was filled with the scent of sun-baked pine and the acrid tang of industrial dust, a smell that had become synonymous with the hunt for the man known as Mikhail Yudin. In the distance, the low hum of the city continued, oblivious to the fact that the tension within a small, unmarked car was about to snap. The detectives watched the figure moving with a strange, mechanical stiffness across the parched earth, their eyes fixed on every calculated movement. This was no longer a game of shadows. It was the final moment before the strike. The arrest was not a cinematic explosion of noise and violence. Instead, it was a sudden, surgical enclosure. As Yudin reached the edge of a wooded path, a place where the shadows of the birch trees stretched long and thin like skeletal fingers, the doors of the unmarked vehicles swung open in near-perfect unison. The sound of boots on dry gravel was sharp and rhythmic. 2 officers closed the distance before he could even register the shift in the atmosphere. There was a brief, sharp intake of breath from the suspect, a momentary widening of his eyes that betrayed a flicker of animal realization. But there was no struggle. As the heavy metal of the handcuffs clicked into place, the sound seemed to echo through the still, hot air of the afternoon. 2 clicks, one for each wrist. A sound that marked the end of a 3-year reign of terror. Yudin simply looked down at his hands, his face settling back into a mask of sullen indifference that chilled the men holding him. The journey to the precinct was conducted in a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence in the car. Outside, the landscape of 2002 drifted past the windows in a haze of golden light and deep shadows. They drove past the industrial outskirts, past the skeletal remains of old factories where Yudin had once found work, and eventually his prey. Inside the vehicle, the air conditioner struggled against the sweltering heat, blowing a thin, metallic-smelling breeze that did little to ease the tension. Yudin sat in the back, flanked by two detectives whose shirts were darkened with sweat. He did not look at them. He stared straight ahead, his breathing slow and shallow, as if he were trying to disappear into the upholstery. To the officers, he didn't look like a monster. He looked like a weary laborer, a man of the earth who had spent too much time in the dark places of the forest. This mundane appearance made the reality of his crimes feel even more disjointed and surreal. When they arrived at the precinct, the atmosphere was a chaotic blend of adrenaline and exhaustion. The building was an old, crumbling structure where the walls were painted a sickly shade of institutional green, now peeling in long, curling strips. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes, floor wax, and the metallic tang of old radiators. Typewriters clattered in the background, a relic of a system still catching up to the modern world, and the flickering fluorescent lights overhead hummed a low, discordant note. As Yudin was led through the corridor, the usual bustle of the station seemed to fall away. Officers stopped at their desks, their eyes following the man in the center of the huddle. There was no shouting, no triumphant cheers. There was only a heavy, expectant quiet. They led him toward the back, past the holding cells, to a room that had been prepared specifically for this encounter. The interrogation room was a small, windowless box that felt even tighter in the oppressive August heat. A single, heavy wooden table sat in the center, scarred with the marks of countless pens and nervous fingernails. Above it, a solitary lamp cast a harsh, circular pool of yellow light, leaving the corners of the room in deep, murky shadow. The detectives allowed a few minutes to pass before entering, letting the silence of the room work on Yudin. Through the one-way glass, they watched him. He sat perfectly still. He did not fidget. He did not look around the room with curiosity or fear. He simply stared at the grain of the wood on the table. It was the patience of a hunter, or perhaps the resignation of a man who had known this day would eventually arrive. When the lead investigator finally stepped inside, the click of the door felt like the final bolt being slid into place. The initial interrogation began not with a confrontation, but with a quiet, measured observation. The detective sat across from Yudin, placing a thick folder on the table between them. The paper was slightly damp from the humidity, the edges softened by the sweat of many hands. For several minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall and the distant, muffled sound of a siren somewhere out in the city. The detective watched the way Yudin's hands rested on his knees, large, calloused hands that spoke of a life of hard physical labor. When the first question was finally asked, it was soft, almost conversational. They asked about the forest. They asked about the long walks he took in the outskirts of Birdsk. Yudin's voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, raspy murmur, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He didn't deny being there. He spoke of the woods with a strange, possessive affection, his words painting a picture of a man who felt more at home among the trees than among people. As the night deepened, the atmosphere in the precinct shifted from the frantic energy of the arrest to a somber, focused intensity. Outside, the heat of the day slowly gave way to a warm, humid evening, but inside the interrogation room, the temperature seemed to rise with every passing hour. The detectives brought in photographs, images of the trophies Yudin had kept, the items taken from those who never returned home. They laid them out on the wooden table, one by one, like a grim deck of cards. The flute he had taken from the young student, the small trinkets that had once meant everything to someone. In the harsh light of the lamp, these objects seemed to pulse with a tragic energy. Yudin's eyes flickered as he looked at them. For the first time, the mask of indifference began to crack, replaced by a dark, shimmering pride. The capture in August was over, but the true descent into the mind of the maniac was only just beginning. The interrogation room in the precinct was a narrow, airless chamber where the very walls seemed to lean in, heavy with the weight of the secrets they had absorbed over the years. A single fluorescent bulb hummed overhead, casting a cold, flickering light that danced across the peeling gray paint and the scarred surface of the wooden table. Mikhail Yudin sat there with a stillness that was deeply unsettling, his posture upright and his hands resting quietly before him. The atmosphere had shifted entirely from the frantic energy of the arrest. It was now a space of somber, focused intensity. The only sounds were the distant, rhythmic ticking of a clock and the low, mechanical groan of the building's old heating system. Every breath felt deliberate, every movement amplified in the profound silence. Investigators watched him through the haze of stale coffee and the scent of damp wool, waiting for the first crack in the silence that had protected his crimes for so long. When Yudin finally spoke, his voice was a calm, almost academic monotone that sent a chill through the room. He did not provide the frantic excuses of a desperate man, but rather a methodical recount of the years between 1999 and 2002. He spoke of the streets of Berdsk and Novosibirsk as if he were tracing a familiar map, detailing the dark corners and deserted plantations where he had encountered his victims. He recounted the night in late 1998 when he first crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and moved steadily into the shadows of 1999. The investigators leaned forward, their pens scratching against paper in a frantic attempt to capture every word. He spoke of 5 specific lives he had taken, describing the moments of their passing with a lack of emotion that was more terrifying than any outburst of anger could ever be. As the hours stretched on, the confession turned to the physical remnants of his actions, the items he had kept. These were not mere pieces of evidence to him, they were trophies. He spoke with startling clarity about a flute he had taken from a young student of the Novosibirsk Conservatory in the year 2000. She had been returning from a musical rehearsal, the instrument a symbol of her future, before it became a token in his collection. He described a fur coat he had stolen in 1999, an item he had later presented to his own wife as a common gift, weaving the darkness of his double life into the fabric of his home. There were watches and earrings, pieces of jewelry that had once belonged to daughters and sisters, now reduced to cold metallic prizes that he kept hidden away. The way he remembered the weight and texture of these objects revealed a mind that valued the possession more than the person. Based on the harrowing details of his statement, a team of investigators was dispatched to his property in Berdsk. The air outside was biting, smelling of wood smoke and frozen earth as they approached a small, nondescript barn. This structure, which appeared ordinary to any passerby, was the sanctuary where Yudin had spent hours in quiet contemplation. Inside, the beam of their flashlights cut through the thick dust, illuminating a space filled with the shadows of his crimes. They began a meticulous search, lifting floorboards and peering into hidden crevices. It was here that they found the flute, the jewelry, and the other personal effects he had described with such chilling accuracy. The barn was no longer just a place for storage. It was a museum of tragedy, where the physical proof of his admissions lay waiting to be reclaimed by the light of justice. The verification of the victim count required more than just his verbal testimony. It required the cold, unyielding precision of genetic science. Forensic experts worked through the night, comparing DNA from the items recovered on the property to the samples provided by families who had spent years searching for their missing loved ones. They looked back at the unsolved cases from 1999, 2000, and 2002 with a renewed and grim focus. One by one, the connections were made. The student with the flute, the young woman taken from her own apartment, the girls lured to the outskirts of the city. Their identities were finally confirmed. The science tied Yudin to 5 murders, as well as over 20 other incidents of robbery and assault that had haunted the region. The tally was no longer a matter of speculation. It was a definitive record of a period of terror. By the time the sun began to rise over the precinct, the atmosphere of the room had changed from one of anticipation to one of profound exhaustion. The official count of 5 confirmed lives lost, alongside the 23 cases of other violent crimes, weighed heavily on everyone present. Yudin had stripped away the mystery, leaving behind only the stark, painful reality of what had happened during those 4 years. The verification was complete, the trophies were catalogued, and the man who had haunted the shadows of Birdsk was now bound by the truth of his own words. The long investigation into the years between 1999 and 2002 had reached its somber conclusion, leaving the investigators to process the sheer scale of the darkness they had finally brought into the light. The names were recorded, the families were notified, and the official record of the maniac's confession was closed. The echoes of that long night in the precinct eventually faded into the bureaucratic hum of the justice system. The transition from the feverish interrogation room to the sterile, echoing halls of the Altai Krai court felt like moving from a nightmare into a cold, waking reality. By the time the final trial proceedings began in the winter of 2004, the city of Barnaul was already blanketed in a thick, insulating layer of snow. The air outside was sharp enough to steal your breath, a stark contrast to the stifling, heavy atmosphere inside the courtroom. The wooden benches were worn smooth by the weight of waiting families, their faces etched with a weary hope for closure that had been 3 years in the making. In that room, the passage of time felt suspended, caught between the horrors of the past and the finality of the law. Mikhail Yudin sat within the glass enclosure, a figure whose unremarkable appearance remained his most chilling trait. He was a man of 30 years at the time, looking more like a quiet laborer than the specter that had haunted the plantations and bus stops of the region. The prosecution began to lay out the physical remnants of his crimes, transforming the courtroom into a gallery of stolen lives. There was a particular, haunting stillness when they produced the flute. It had belonged to a young student from the Novosibirsk Conservatory, a girl who had been returning from a rehearsal when she crossed his path. To see such a delicate instrument, designed for music and breath, presented as a trophy of violence, sent a shiver through those gathered. It was a tangible piece of a life interrupted, now reduced to a numbered exhibit in a cardboard box. The details of the other items were no less harrowing. A simple wristwatch and a pair of earrings were described with agonizing precision. These were not expensive treasures, but they were the intimate possessions of the victims from 1999. The court listened in a heavy, collective silence as it was revealed that Yudin had gifted these stolen trinkets to his own wife and mother. The psychological weight of that detail was immense. The idea of a man returning from the darkness of the bushes to the warmth of a domestic home, carrying the jewelry of a woman he had just murdered. It painted a picture of a mind that operated with a terrifying, compartmentalized coldness, viewing his victims as nothing more than sources of materials for his own life. Throughout the proceedings, the psychiatric experts offered their findings. They spoke of his sullen nature, his stiffness in communication, and the way his personality seemed to sharpen and darken under the influence of intoxication. Yet, despite the complexity of his internal world, the forensic examination was clear. Mikhail Yudin was sane. He was responsible. He knew the weight of every choice he made from 1999 through the end of 2002. The defense argued for leniency, pointing toward a life of quiet labor and a lack of previous high-profile violence. But the evidence of 5 confirmed murders and 23 counts of robbery and assault weighed too heavily. The scales of justice were tipping, and the room seemed to grow colder as the final hour approached. On the 2nd of December, 2004, the verdict was delivered. The judge's voice was a steady drone against the backdrop of a radiator's hiss. Life imprisonment. It was the maximum sentence, a decree that Yudin would spend the remainder of his days in a high-security colony, far from the streets of Barnaul and the plantations of Birdsk. He was eventually transported to the Polar Owl prison, a place where the sun barely rises and the isolation is as absolute as the stone walls. In that moment, The tension that had gripped the region for years seemed to dissipate, replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. The families stood up, some weeping, some merely staring at the empty glass box where the man had been. The monster was gone, but the spaces he left behind would remain empty forever. The legacy of the case rests in the quiet corners of the Altai territory. For a time, the city changed. Parents held their children closer at bus stops, and the shadowed paths near the university were avoided long after the sun went down. But as the years turned into decades, the sharp edges of the fear began to soften. Barnaul moved forward, its streets filled with new voices and new stories, though the ghosts of the late 90s still linger in the yellowed pages of police archives. We remember the victims not for how they left this world, but for the lives they were meant to lead, the music that should have been played on that flute, the hours that should have been marked by that watch. The darkness has been answered by the law, and the city has reclaimed its peace. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.